The Smoky Mountains stretched before them, a sea of mist and endless ridges that looked more like the edge of the world than a place on a map. The U.S. Army had chosen this remote part of Appalachia for a simple reason: its unforgiving terrain. If soldiers could learn to survive and operate here, they could do it anywhere. The unit that marched into those woods believed they were heading out for just another field training exercise. Their packs were heavy, their rifles ready, and their minds focused on orders. What they didn't realize was that their mission would push them far beyond the limits of military drills. Something else was waiting for them among the ridges, something that no textbook or strategy could prepare them for. It began as nothing more than a rumor whispered in the small town at the base of the mountains. The soldiers stopped there briefly, buying last-minute supplies and asking for directions to old logging trails that would take them deeper into the forest. The locals were polite, even helpful, but behind every smile was hesitation. One older man, his skin weathered from years of mountain life, stepped close and warned them quietly, "Stay away from the high ridges when the moon is full." "That's when he walks." The soldiers laughed, brushing it off as mountain superstition. Soldiers had heard ghost stories and campfire tales in every corner of the world. None of them had ever been true, or so they thought. Still, the warning lingered in the back of their minds as they started their climb. The Smokies were beautiful but harsh, dense forests where sunlight barely reached the ground, slopes that seemed endless, and a silence that felt too deep, too heavy. The higher they climbed, the more the wilderness swallowed them. Paths disappeared under carpets of leaves, the mist grew thick, and the forest seemed to twist itself into a maze. A few of the men joked to keep spirits high, but their laughter felt thin against the oppressive stillness of the mountains. The first night, they made camp near a stream. The air was cool, the water clear, and the forest around them, alive with the usual sounds of crickets and owls. But even then, something was off. The stream seemed quieter than it should have been, like the sound had been swallowed up by the trees. One soldier swore he saw movement in the distance, just beyond the tree line, but when others looked, there was nothing. They chalked it up to nerves. They were deep in unfamiliar territory. Their minds were playing tricks on them. As they sat around the fire, another local's warning came back to them. Earlier that day, an elderly woman had muttered something strange as they passed her cabin. She told them that long before settlers came, the Cherokee had told stories of a guardian, a giant who lived among the ridges, taller than any man, older than the mountains themselves. It was not a creature to be hunted, not an animal to be killed, but a force of nature, cursed and eternal. According to her, it walked at night, protecting what was sacred, punishing those who trespassed too far. Again, the soldiers had brushed it off, though a few exchanged uneasy glances. The next day, the terrain grew worse. The ridges were steep and covered in fog so thick that men could barely see the soldier in front of them. Their compasses spun strangely, as though the iron in the mountains themselves wanted them lost. They found abandoned logging camps, their cabins half-rotted and tools rusting in the soil. The eerie part wasn't that these places were deserted, it was that they felt deserted in a hurry. Axes left mid-swing in logs, saws dropped on the ground, cooking pots overturned as though people had run in fear. No animals moved in those clearings, no birds sang overhead. By the third night, the soldiers were beginning to feel the weight of the Smokies pressing down on them. Their rations tasted stale, their boots were wet and heavy, and morale was slipping. Still, they kept moving, driven by orders and the belief that the forest was just playing tricks on them. Around the fire, their conversations grew quieter, more serious. One soldier admitted he felt like they were being watched. Another confessed that he had seen footprints in the mud earlier that day, huge, human-like, but impossibly large. He didn't say it loudly, afraid the others would mock him, but the look in his eyes was enough to silence any laughter. The forest itself seemed to react to their presence. Branches snapped in the distance when no one was there. Rocks tumbled down slopes without cause. At night, the usual forest sounds grew eerily quiet, replaced by long stretches of silence, broken only by the occasional thud, something heavy moving in the dark. The soldiers set extra watches around camp, but every time they peered into the mist, all they saw was shifting shadows. One soldier wrote in his field journal, "Something about this place doesn't feel right. It feels old, older than us, older than America." older than the world we know. The mountains don't want us here. He didn't show the entry to anyone, but more than one man felt the same. By the fourth day, they were too deep to turn back easily. Supplies were low, but they pressed on, following their orders. That was when they began to see the signs. Trees marked with strange carvings, symbols none of them recognized. Circles of stones blackened by fire, though no one lived for miles. The Cherokee trackers in their unit grew tense, warning that these were not natural and not to be touched. But curiosity got the better of some. A young soldier picked up a carved stone from one of the circles, joking that he'd bring it home as a souvenir. The laughter stopped when the forest itself seemed to groan, a low, distant sound carried on the wind. That night, the unease reached its peak. As they sat around their small fire, mist curling around their boots, the silence was broken by something new. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. The ground seemed to tremble with each one. The soldiers froze, listening. The sound came from just beyond the tree line, circling the camp, always out of sight. A few raised their rifles, whispering for permission to fire, but their commander held them back. "Animals," he said firmly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just animals." But deep down, every man there knew this was no bear, no deer, no creature of flesh and blood that belonged in the Smokies. Whatever was out there was bigger, heavier, and far older than anything they had ever faced. When the sound finally stopped, the men sat in tense silence, rifles gripped tightly, eyes on the shadows. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it brought dreams of enormous figures moving silently through the mist, watching from just beyond the firelight. The mission was only just beginning, but already the soldiers felt it. The Smoky Mountains were no ordinary wilderness. They were entering a place ruled not by men, not by armies or governments, but by something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. Something that walked when the moon was full. The second phase of the mission should have been routine, mapping the ridges, testing their endurance, and documenting potential supply routes. On paper, it was nothing extraordinary, but in the mountains, paper and reality rarely matched. By now, the soldiers were restless, worn thin from sleepless nights and the strange unease that clung to them like the mist. Even hardened men who had marched through battlefields abroad felt something here that unsettled them. It wasn't enemy fire or ambushes. It was the quiet, the deep, unnatural quiet that seemed to follow their every step. Morning began with a thick fog rolling through the valley, heavier than any they had yet seen. It swallowed their camp, forcing them to pack their gear in near blindness. Every branch creaked like it carried a weight too heavy for it. Every drop of dew falling through the fog sounded sharper than it should. One of the younger soldiers muttered, half to himself, that the forest was breathing. The others didn't laugh. None of them had the energy for jokes anymore. Their commander ordered them forward, insisting they stay on schedule. The unit moved in single file, following a barely visible animal trail. The higher they climbed, the worse the fog grew, thickening until each man could only see the outline of the one in front of him. That was when the whispers began. At first, the soldiers thought it was just the wind carrying strange sounds through the valleys, but it wasn't the wind. The voices were low, broken, impossible to place. Sometimes it was as if someone was calling their names, other times it sounded like chanting, old, rhythmic, and in a language none of them recognized. They froze, rifles raised, listening, but the whispers always stopped when they tried to pinpoint the source. By midday, tension was high. One soldier swore he saw a figure moving parallel to them along the ridgeline, but when the others turned to look, the slope was empty. Another spotted what he thought was smoke in the trees. Thin, black trails curling upward, but when they reached the spot there was nothing, no fire, no ash. Just more forest, silent and waiting. Then came the tracks. They stumbled across them near a dry creek bed. Enormous footprints pressed deep into the soil, far larger than any humans could ever be. Each print was nearly twice the length of a boot and sunk deeper than the weight of even the heaviest soldier could manage. The prints didn't follow a straight path. They weaved in and out of the creek bed, circling rocks, vanishing into the underbrush, then reappearing again as though whatever made them had been pacing, watching, waiting. The Cherokee scout among them grew pale when he saw the tracks. He told the others in a low voice that these were not new. They were ancient. The stories had always said the creature still walked the mountains, but few believed them. To him, these tracks were proof that the old legends were not just stories. The men tried to dismiss it, but no one dared step into the prints themselves. They skirted around them, rifles gripped tighter than before. The mood soured further when they stumbled upon another abandoned site. This time, it wasn't a logging camp. It was older. At the center of the clearing stood a mound of stones, stacked carefully as if forming a crude monument. Around it, wooden stakes jutted from the ground, splintered and worn, many carved with strange markings. A few bore what looked like crude faces, worn by time and weather. The soldiers argued whether it was some kind of grave, a shrine, or just remnants of a settler's superstition. But one thing was clear: it had not been touched in years, maybe decades. Yet it felt wrong, too deliberate, too ominous. The commander ordered the men to leave it undisturbed, but not before one soldier, trying to lighten the mood, knocked one of the smaller stones loose from the mound. The Cherokee scout warned him sharply, his voice carrying real fear now that this was a dangerous mistake. "You don't take from the dead," he said, staring into the fog as though expecting something to emerge. The others laughed uneasily and moved on, but even the one who had shifted the stone seemed shaken. He dropped it quickly and hurried to catch up with the group. That night, the forest grew alive with sounds unlike anything they had heard before. The men lay awake in their tents, listening as heavy branches snapped in the darkness. Something enormous was moving just beyond the tree line. The sound came closer, then stopped. Minutes dragged into hours, the soldiers frozen in silence, each one holding his breath, waiting for the sound to return. And then it did. A guttural roar, deep and bone-shaking, rolled through the mountains. It wasn't the sound of a bear, nor a mountain lion. It was deeper, older, almost human yet monstrous. The ground trembled with the force of it, sending a chill through every man's blood. The soldiers bolted upright, rifles in hand, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But the fog was too thick. All they saw were shifting shadows and the dull glow of their fire. One soldier swore he saw two eyes gleaming through the mist, high above the ground, far too high for any man or animal. They blinked once, then vanished, leaving only the echo of the roar lingering in the night. No one slept after that. They sat huddled together, weapons ready, whispering theories and fears. Some believed it was a trick of the forest. Others were convinced it was something out of the old legends, the Cherokee Giant that had been spoken of in hushed voices for centuries. Whatever it was watching them now. That much they knew. By dawn, the men were exhausted, their nerves frayed. Their commander tried to rally them, insisting they push deeper into the mountains. But as they marched on, the soldiers couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer the hunters in this wilderness. Something was hunting them, and it was only a matter of time before it stepped out of the mist. The men marched in silence, every step echoing with the memory of the roar that had shattered the night. Even the crunch of boots on the leaf-strewn ground sounded too loud, like it might draw the attention of whatever lurked beyond the fog. Their commander pushed them forward, but the men could feel it. The change in the forest, the air was heavier, pressing against their lungs with every breath. Birds no longer sang, squirrels no longer scurried. It was as if the forest itself had emptied, leaving only them and something that wanted them gone. By mid-morning, they reached a narrow gorge, the trail snaking between towering rock faces on either side. The fog hung thick here, turning the rocks into shadowy sentinels. The Cherokee scout warned that this was dangerous ground, a place where travelers vanished in the old stories. The commander dismissed it, urging the men to move quickly, but his voice lacked its usual firmness. Even he could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from above. As they advanced, the silence fractured. Somewhere deep in the gorge, stone clattered against stone, echoing like footsteps. The men froze, rifles raised, eyes scanning the ridges. Another clatter followed, this one closer, louder. Then from high above, a rock the size of a man's helmet came crashing down, striking the trail just yards in front of the lead soldier. Dirt and fragments sprayed outward. The soldiers jumped back, hearts pounding. Another rock followed, this one smashing into the cliff wall with a bone-rattling thud. The men shouted, searching the ridges for whoever or whatever was hurling them. But the fog concealed everything. Only faint shapes shifted high above, massive silhouettes too large to be human. The commander barked orders, and the men scrambled, pressing against the rock face to avoid becoming easy targets. One soldier, trembling, raised his rifle and fired into the mist. The shot echoed through the gorge, but no cry of pain followed, no movement, only silence, then another thunderous crash as yet another boulder rolled down the slope, scattering the men like startled prey. When they finally stumbled out of the gorge, their breaths ragged and their nerves raw, the men swore they had seen shadows moving along the cliffs, huge figures keeping pace with them, herding them out like wolves driving sheep. That night they dared not light a fire. They huddled in the darkness beneath the skeletal branches of dead trees. Listening, the forest was alive again, but not in any comforting way. Low groans echoed through the valleys, like wood bending under pressure. Branches snapped in the undergrowth. Heavy footsteps circled them in the dark. At one point, something massive brushed against the trees just yards from their camp, sending showers of leaves tumbling down. The Cherokee scout whispered that they had angered the spirit of the land, that the stones in the shrine they had disturbed had not been markers of death, but warnings. The commander silenced him, but the men listened more to the scout than to their officer. Fear had eroded discipline. The army had trained them for battle with men, but not for this. Sometime past midnight, a scream tore through the night. One of the sentries, positioned on the edge of camp, vanished mid-cry. The soldiers bolted upright, fumbling for weapons. Flashlights swung wildly across the trees, catching nothing but mist and bark. But then they saw it, drag marks in the dirt, leading into the brush. Boots had carved desperate trenches in the earth as the sentry had been pulled away. They followed the trail, rifles raised, hearts pounding. The drag marks led only a dozen yards before stopping abruptly. There was no body, no blood, just a single, massive footprint pressed deep into the soil beside the last scuff of boots. The men stood frozen, staring at the print. It was larger than any they had seen before, deep, wide, and fresh. The commander ordered them back to camp, his voice cracking as he tried to sound in control. But everyone knew one of their own was gone, and the forest had swallowed him whole. Sleep was impossible after that. The men sat in a ring, rifles clutched, eyes darting at every sound. Sometimes they swore they heard breathing just beyond the darkness, slow and heavy, inhuman. Other times, faint laughter echoed through the fog, mocking, cruel like a child mimicking human voices. The Cherokee scout's hands shook as he whispered prayers in his native tongue, words the others didn't understand, but felt in their bones. Dawn brought no relief. The forest seemed darker even under the rising sun. Branches snapped overhead as though something massive was still following them, moving when they moved, stopping when they stopped. As they prepared to leave, one soldier noticed something carved into a tree at the edge of camp. The bark had been stripped away, exposing the pale wood beneath. Etched deep into it was a crude drawing, a stick figure, arms outstretched, its head marked with jagged lines. Beside it were dozens of smaller figures, all lying flat, their bodies crossed out. None of the soldiers had made it. None of them could explain how it had appeared overnight, without a sound. The men exchanged terrified glances. It was no longer just footprints, no longer just shadows. Something intelligent was toying with them, letting them know it was close. And as they marched on, each man wondered if he would be the next to vanish into the mist. The soldiers moved deeper into the Smoky Mountains, but their march was no longer a disciplined column. It was a staggered, jittery shuffle, every man glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see something monstrous looming behind him. They spoke little, their voices hushed, as if even words might summon the thing that stalked them. The forest felt tighter now. The trees packed closer together, their branches knotted into twisted shapes that blocked out the sky. A perpetual gloom hung over the trail, and even at midday, the light struggled to break through. The Cherokee scout muttered under his breath, warning them that the deeper they went, the closer they were to the hunting grounds of something ancient, something that lived between worlds, half spirit, half flesh. The soldiers didn't want to believe him, but after the missing sentry, the boulders, and the footprint, disbelief was harder to cling to. By afternoon, the men reached a clearing where the remains of cabins stood, rotting logs stacked in collapsed walls, stone chimneys blackened with moss, and doorways that led to nothing but emptiness. A ghost town. Their boots thudded softly against the mossy earth as they explored, rifles ready. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, and the air smelled faintly of damp rot. One soldier pushed open a half-collapsed door. It swung slowly, creaking, before revealing the inside of the cabin. Broken furniture lay scattered on the floor, claw marks gouged into the walls, not scratches from animals, too large, too deep. They looked like the slashes of something strong enough to tear wood, as though it were cloth. Another soldier, searching a second cabin, froze. In the dust and grime on the floor, a pattern had been scratched. Symbols arranged in circles, spirals, and jagged lines. No one could read them, but their meaning didn't need translation. They screamed of warnings. The Cherokee scout whispered that these were marks left to ward off evil, carved in desperation by those who once lived here. Judging by the silence of the village, it hadn't worked. The men wanted to move on quickly, but the commander insisted they camp here, arguing the ruined cabins would give shelter for the night. His words were practical, but his eyes betrayed doubt. None of the soldiers wanted to stay, but none dared to speak against orders. Reluctantly, they prepared for another night in the cursed woods. As darkness fell, fog rolled into the clearing, curling around the ruined cabins like smoke. The men built small fires, trying to pierce the mist, but the flames only seemed to shrink against the suffocating dark. Every crackle of the fire was answered by sounds from the forest. Heavy footsteps, dragging noises, the snapping of branches under immense weight. One soldier swore he saw something moving between the trees, huge and hulking, yet fast, gliding from one shadow to the next. Another heard low, guttural breathing, so close it felt as though something enormous was standing just outside the ring of firelight. They clutched their rifles tighter, knuckles white, eyes wide and unblinking. Then came the smell. A stench rolled into camp, foul and nauseating, like rotting meat left in the sun. It was so strong that men gagged, covering their mouths and noses. One soldier whispered that it smelled like death itself, and no one argued. The Cherokee scout whispered that the creature carried the smell with it, a warning of its approach. The first sign of attack came with a scream. One of the men posted on watch vanished in an instant, yanked backwards into the fog with a force so sudden that his rifle clattered to the ground. The soldiers leapt to their feet, shouting his name, their flashlights cutting through the mist. But there was nothing there, just the sound of thrashing in the trees, then silence. The commander barked orders to hold the line, but before the men could form any kind of defense, another soldier was struck. Something massive slammed against the wall of a ruined cabin, and a figure crumpled to the ground, blood running from his head. His body was dragged away before anyone could fire a shot. The forest swallowed him whole. Gunfire erupted. The men sprayed bullets into the fog, the muzzle flashes lighting their terrified faces, but the fog gave them nothing in return. No body, no cry of pain, only shadows, only movement just beyond sight. The gunfire echoed through the trees until the rifles clicked empty, and still the forest gave no answer. In the aftermath, silence returned, heavier than before. The fires sputtered, the mist thickened, and the men huddled close, their nerves stretched thin. One soldier broke down, whispering that they were being hunted, that this wasn't a fight, they were prey in someone else's territory. And then, as the firelight dimmed, they saw it. At the edge of the fog, towering over the trees, stood a figure. Its silhouette was massive, shoulders broad, arms long, its head crowned with tangled hair that hung like a mane. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, not bright but reflective, catching the firelight like those of a predator. It did not move closer, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The men froze, every muscle locked. No one breathed. For a moment the world stopped, then slowly the figure turned and melted back into the mist, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. The soldiers didn't sleep that night. They couldn't. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind against the cabins, every distant howl made them flinch. They were deep in the Smoky Mountains now, and the Cherokee Giant was no longer just a story. It was watching, waiting, and reminding them that escape was not guaranteed. The night dragged on endlessly, and when dawn finally came, it did not bring relief. The fog remained, thick and suffocating, refusing to lift even under the pale light of morning. The soldiers looked like ghosts themselves, faces hollow, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling around their rifles. The commander gave the order to move out. Staying in that ruined village meant death, and every man knew it. They packed quickly, barely speaking, their movements sharp and hurried. Each soldier kept glancing toward the tree line, dreading another glimpse of the giant. The Cherokee scout warned them that leaving would not free them, that once the giant marked prey, it would follow. Still, none of them could stand another night in that cursed clearing. The march was brutal. The forest seemed alive now, branches creaking overhead, shadows shifting at the edge of vision. Every sound became a threat. The rustle of leaves, the groan of trees in the wind, even the calls of distant animals. The men kept their rifles raised, twitching at every noise, but the deeper they went, the quieter the forest grew. Birds no longer sang, no insects hummed. It was as if all life had fled, leaving only silence for the soldiers to walk through. By midday, they reached a narrow ravine where the ground turned to stone and jagged cliffs pressed in on both sides. The Cherokee scout hesitated, warning them that this was a hunting corridor, a place where the giant was said to trap its victims. The commander brushed him off, insisting it was the fastest way through. The ravines swallowed them whole. The walls loomed high, the sky reduced to a narrow strip above. Every sound echoed boots crunching gravel, the clink of metal gear, even the nervous breathing of the men. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. Halfway through, the first rock fell. It wasn't large, just a fist-sized stone that clattered down from above, but it was enough to stop the column cold. Heads snapped upward, rifles aimed at the ridgeline. Nothing, just jagged rock and drifting fog. Then another stone, and another. Soon the sound of rocks tumbling echoed on both sides, bouncing down the cliffs as if the mountain itself was shaking loose. Suddenly, a massive boulder crashed down, striking the path ahead and shattering into pieces. Dust and gravel sprayed over the men. Panic rippled through the group. The commander shouted for them to move quickly, to keep going before they were crushed. The soldiers sprinted, stumbling over uneven ground as more stones rained down. Then, over the sound of falling rock, came something worse, a deep, guttural roar that shook the walls of the ravine. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal. It was both and neither. The sound froze the men mid-stride, their instincts screaming that they were prey. The Cherokee scout fell to his knees, chanting under his breath, his voice trembling. The soldiers dragged him up, forcing him forward, but the terror in his eyes spread like fire through the group. They weren't just being chased, they were being toyed with. When they finally stumbled out of the ravine, chests heaving, the forest greeted them with silence again. No more falling rocks, no roar, just stillness. Some of the men collapsed, clutching their rifles, whispering that it had been right above them. They had felt its eyes, heavy and merciless, watching every step. The commander forced them onward, but discipline was breaking. Arguments flared. One soldier accused another of firing blindly into the fog the night before, risking friendly fire. Another swore the commander was leading them in circles deeper into the beast's territory. Their voices rose, fear turning into anger. The Cherokee scout warned them sharply that arguing would only draw it closer. The giant, he said, was not just a hunter of flesh. It fed on fear, division, and weakness. As night fell again, they set up camp reluctantly, building small fires that barely pushed back the dark. The men refused to sleep, eyes darting to the trees, rifles ready, but exhaustion crept in, heavy as the fog. One by one, they nodded off, despite their best efforts. That was when the screaming began. The first came from the far side of camp. A soldier had wandered too close to the tree line, perhaps to relieve himself, perhaps to run. A massive shadow swept down, and his scream split the night before cutting off abruptly. By the time the others raised their rifles, the man was gone. Chaos erupted. Soldiers shouted, stumbling over each other. firing into the darkness. The fog lit up with muzzle flashes, but their bullets only tore through trees and shadows. The commander tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by gunfire and panic. Then came the roar again, closer this time, shaking the very ground. It was followed by the sound of trees cracking, as if something massive was pushing its way toward them. Fires flickered, shadows stretched, and in the chaos, one soldier swore he saw it, a giant hand, larger than a man's chest, gripping a tree trunk before slipping back into the fog. The camp broke. Discipline shattered completely. Men fled into the trees, screaming, rifles clattering as they vanished into the night. Others dropped to their knees, praying. Only a handful stayed with the commander, huddled by the fire, knowing running was useless. The forest belonged to the giant. When morning came, the survivors were fewer. The camp was littered with abandoned gear, torn packs, and bloodstains. No bodies, just silence. The Cherokee scouts' words echoed in their minds. Once marked, they would never truly escape. The Smoky Mountains had claimed many before, and now it had claimed more. The commander rallied what men he had left. They would push forward. They had no choice, but each survivor carried the same hollow look in his eyes. They knew now what they faced. The Cherokee Giant wasn't just a story. It was real. It was hunting them, and it would not stop. The survivors pressed on, though their march no longer resembled the organized stride of trained soldiers. It was slower, more uneven, the men dragging their boots through mud and leaves, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Every step felt heavier than the last. They were not only carrying rifles and gear anymore, they carried the weight of fear, the memories of screams that still echoed in the night, and the knowledge that the Cherokee Giant was still with them. The commander tried to bark orders, but his voice no longer carried the same authority. The men listened, yes, but only because there was no other choice. Deep down, they knew they were beyond rescue. Radios were useless. Maps seemed meaningless. The forest twisted around them in unnatural ways. Trails looping back where they shouldn't, landmarks shifting as if the woods themselves were alive. The Cherokee scout was their only anchor. He walked with his head low, whispering prayers in his language, sometimes scattering small handfuls of herbs or ash along the ground. When the men demanded answers, he finally told them what none wanted to hear. The Cherokee Giant was more than flesh and blood. It was tied to the land, bound to the mountains. Killing it with bullets would not be enough. To face it, they would need courage greater than their fear. The words did not comfort the men. Courage was something they no longer possessed. That night, the fog returned thicker than ever, a suffocating blanket that swallowed the trees and even muted the crackling of their fires. They huddled close, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. Shadows writhed in the mist. The men gripped their rifles so tightly their knuckles turned white. It began with whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind. Then they realized the voices carried words, soft, broken fragments of sentences that sounded like the voices of the very men they had lost. One soldier swore he heard his friend calling his name from the fog, his tone desperate, pleading. Another claimed he heard the voice of his mother telling him to come home. The commander ordered them to stay put, not to move, but the voices grew stronger, weaving through the mist until it felt like they were surrounded by ghosts. Some men clamped their hands over their ears. Others broke. One soldier leapt to his feet, screaming that his brother was out there. Before anyone could stop him, he ran into the fog, vanishing instantly. His shouts echoed for only a moment before they were cut off by a wet, bone-snapping crunch. Silence followed. Panic rippled through the camp. The soldiers raised their rifles, firing blindly into the fog, but the bullets only vanished into the mist, hitting nothing. Their muzzle flashes lit up pale shapes moving just beyond reach. Massive outlines, impossible limbs, shifting faster than their eyes could track. Then came the roar, louder than before. So close it rattled their bones. The ground shook beneath them as if the very earth was groaning. The Cherokee scout shouted over the chaos, warning them not to run, that scattering would only feed the beast's hunger, but fear drowned out reason. Men broke ranks again, sprinting into the woods, their screams echoing in all directions. Some tripped in the dark, their cries ending abruptly. Others fired as they ran, bullets sparking against trees. Through it all, the commander stayed rooted, his face pale but determined. He yelled for the few who remained to stand their ground, to hold the fire and keep their backs together. Slowly, a small circle formed, just a handful of men and the scout, their rifles aimed outward, the fire burning between them. That was when they saw it clearly for the first time. The fog parted, and from the shadows stepped a figure so massive it dwarfed the trees. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, its shoulders broader than any man, its chest heaving with every thunderous breath. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, yellow, unblinking, filled with something older and more merciless than rage. The Cherokee Giant stood at the edge of the fire's glow, watching them. Its hand, long and clawed, reached out and grasped a tree trunk. With a casual motion, it snapped the tree in half as if it were no thicker than a twig. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The soldiers froze, every instinct screaming at them to run, but the commander raised his rifle. The others followed, shaking, but unwilling to lower their weapons. The Cherokee scout raised his voice, chanting louder now, his words rising over the growl that rumbled from the giant's chest. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The fog swirled around them, the fire hissed, and the earth trembled under the giant's weight. Then, with a sound that was part roar and part scream, it charged. The ground shook as it barreled forward, its steps shaking the earth like thunder. The soldiers opened fire, their rifles cracking in a deafening chorus. Bullets tore into the giant, but it didn't slow. Blood sprayed, dark, thick, but it only enraged the creature further. It swung one massive arm, and the impact sent two men flying into the darkness, their bodies disappearing without a trace. The circle shattered. The survivors scattered again, diving behind trees, firing desperately into the fog. The commander stood his ground, screaming for the men to hold the line, but the giant's roar drowned him out. The Cherokee scout remained by the fire, his chanting unbroken even as the monster loomed closer. His voice grew stronger, rising with a power that seemed not entirely his own. He called on the spirits of the land, on ancestors long buried, on forces older than the forest itself. The giant paused, its glowing eyes locking on him. For the first time it hesitated. But hesitation was not mercy. With a guttural snarl, it raised its massive hand, preparing to strike the scout down. The firelight danced against its claws, each as long as a knife. The remaining soldiers screamed, raising their rifles again, but they knew the truth. Bullets would not save him. The night had reached its peak. The battle was no longer one of men versus beast. It was a clash between something human and something ancient, something tied to the Smoky Mountains themselves. And for the survivors, it was no longer about victory. It was about survival. The forest had grown impossibly still, as though the very air was holding its breath. The soldiers, battered and weary, dragged themselves through the darkness, every step a reminder of what they had faced. Blood, mud, and fear clung to them like a second skin, and yet there was something heavier in their silence. The knowledge that the Cherokee Giant was not a tale, not a myth, not a whisper meant to scare children. It was real, and it was hunting them still. The survivors could not tell how many hours or days had passed since their patrol had descended into this nightmare. The Smoky Mountains, usually alive with the sound of insects, birds, and running streams, now seemed like a graveyard, suffocating in silence. The men huddled around what little remained of their strength, whispering prayers and curses, their rifles clutched as though they were lifelines. But each man knew the truth, deep down. Bullets had done little to stop the towering figure that had stalked them, and no human weapon could guarantee survival now. They remembered the eyes most of all, eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, not with reflection, but with their own unnatural light. A beast that was half man, half monster, bound by ancient curses and fueled by a hunger that was never sated. The Cherokee tribes had warned them, whispered about the giant of the Smokies that should never be disturbed. But the soldiers had laughed at the stories back then. Now those warnings rang like funeral bells inside their heads. As they stumbled onward, the forest began to change again. The fog thickened, swallowing the moonlight until the trees themselves seemed to bend and twist into monstrous shapes. The survivors began to see shadows moving where nothing should be, as if the forest itself had been watching and waiting. Every time a branch snapped, they froze, expecting the giant figure to step out from behind the trees. And sometimes, they swore they saw him. A flash of movement in the mist. A towering silhouette just beyond the line of vision. The sound of earth cracking under a massive step. One soldier, his nerves shattered, broke from the group and ran. He screamed into the fog, firing his rifle wildly at the trees, his voice cracking with madness. The others didn't follow. They only listened as his gunshots faded, followed by a silence that pressed down like a weight. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the mountain itself. The man's screams were cut off in an instant, leaving only the echo of the beast's voice rolling through the forest. The group tightened, their breath frozen in their throats. They didn't need to speak. They knew he was gone. By dawn, the survivors had dwindled to only a handful. Their bodies were broken, their minds fraying at the edges. One clutched a torn piece of clothing soaked in blood, swearing it belonged to a friend dragged into the fog. Another muttered prayers over and over, not daring to look into the trees, convinced that if he did, the glowing eyes would be there waiting. And always, somewhere just behind them, came the sound of branches cracking, of something impossibly large, moving with patience, as though it knew there was no need to rush. The giant wasn't chasing them, it was hurting them. At last, they stumbled into what seemed like a clearing, but it was no sanctuary. Before them stood the remnants of something ancient, a circle of stones covered in strange markings that none of them could read. It felt like a place older than time itself, heavy with rituals long forgotten. The men felt the weight of history pressing down on them, the realization dawning that they had crossed into forbidden ground. This was not just the giant's hunting ground, this was its domain, its sacred place, and by entering it, they had sealed their fate. One soldier whispered that they should run, another said they should stay and fight, but the debate ended when the trees themselves seemed to tremble. Out from the mist, the giant appeared, towering, broad, its form both manlike and beastly, its eyes glowing with that unholy light, its face, shadowed and broken by scars, looked both human and monstrous, a grotesque reminder that this was no simple creature of flesh and blood. It was something cursed, something bound to this mountain by forces older than war. The men raised their weapons, hands shaking, hearts pounding, but they already knew the truth. No gun could stop this thing. They fired anyway. The sound of gunfire split the clearing, flashes of light tearing through the fog, but the giant didn't fall. It didn't even stagger. Instead, it stepped forward slowly, deliberately, its massive hands curling into fists, its roar echoing like thunder across the mountains. The soldiers screamed, shouted, prayed, but their voices were drowned beneath the beast's bellow. One by one, the fog swallowed their cries. When the smoke cleared, the clearing was silent. The circle of stones stood untouched, as if nothing had happened at all. Only the forest remained, endless and quiet, as though it had claimed every trace of the soldiers for itself. No bodies were ever found, no weapons, no gear. Only whispers remained, carried down from the mountains by those who swore they had seen glowing eyes in the mist, or heard a roar shaking the valleys late at night. Back at the base, the soldiers who never returned were marked as missing. The official reports blamed the wilderness, accidents, perhaps even enemy ambushes. But those who had heard the old Cherokee stories knew better. They whispered of the Smoky Mountains, of the giant that walked between worlds, cursed and eternal, waiting for anyone foolish enough to trespass in its sacred ground. And though their names faded from history, the fear never did. To this day, hikers and locals tell stories of strange sounds in the mountains, of shadows too tall to be human, and of eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The soldiers who entered the Smoky Mountains had vanished into legend, consumed by something far older and darker than they could ever understand. Their tale was not one of victory or survival, but of a warning carved into the silence of the forest. Some places are not meant to be disturbed, and some legends are not just stories. The Cherokee Giant still waits, watching, hunting, guarding the land it has claimed. And for those who enter its domain, there is no return, only fear, silence, and the endless shadow of the giant.